Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about one of the most common libraries inside the React ecosystem that you have to get used to when it comes to being a professional React developer. This library is, of course, Redux. But in order for us to understand Redux, we'll need to understand this concept of a reducer. But I want to take a second just to talk a little bit about Redux and where it fits inside of our current architecture. So, in order for us to understand Redux, we need to actually understand and think back upon context. So, as we remember with context, we have some context inside of our application. Let's take the user context as an example. And this lives somewhere that wraps our entire application. We're able to make an update to the user data that lives inside this user context. Now, of course, this user data, as we know, can be pretty much whatever we want to set it to. But in our particular case, with our own user context, it's really just a current user value. It's either going to hold null or it's going to hold an object. But the main thing to remember is that user context lives outside of the application in a sense that it's at the parent level, so that we can say, I have some component down inside my application. I want to set the current user because this component, let's say for example, is our sign-in page. It will be able to then get that user from Google API or whatever, and then we can propagate that object up into our user context and update current user appropriately. From there, any part in our application, of course, can access this user context. So any component, no matter how far deep down into this application it is able to get that current user object. So here, the main thing I want you to think about this is a state management strategy. When I say state here, I'm not talking about component state, I'm talking about application state or global state. Because now this current user is globally available inside of our application. But the key thing to remember here about this user context, this is one type of state management strategy. We're leveraging user context, if you remember, as a React component, meaning that we're using useState or we're using useEffects in order to update the value of the user context state inside of this context component. Now, the thing to remember is that this, again, is React's context API, which is the default state management solution that React ships with. Redux is an external library that serves a very similar purpose. Not entirely one-to-one, but we'll break down more of the details as to why Context API and Redux are slightly different and why you would want to use one over the other once we understand Redux. But in order to understand Redux, we need to first understand reducers. And reducers is actually a pattern for state management that you can use inside your application. More specifically, you can actually even use it in the current React context that we've written. And let's understand a little bit more about what reducers are. So right now, when you think about your user context, it really just holds an object which has the value of current user, which is either null or an object. It's a very simple context. It's just storing one thing. But let's take a more complicated example, like our cart context. Our cart context is something that contains multiple values. It can store cart items, which is an array of cart item objects. It can store a cart count, which is an integer that represents the total number of things or cart items inside of our cart. And we have a cart total, which is a value representing the total cost of goods inside of our cart. The thing here about cart context is that when you think about cart context inside of our application, I want to zero in fact, on just this little example where we have our shop page. So this is a component tree representing the shop page portion of our application. It has also a bunch of different products, which are represented by product nodes down there, which are those lower level circles. Cart context, as we know, let's say we click and interact with the fourth product card. And here we say, oh, I want to add this product to the cart. Cart context, of course, will update with the added product. But what also needs to happen is cart count needs to update and cart total needs to update. These three different values all update due to an item being added to our cart. And the way that we manage this inside of our cart context as a React component is we have those use effects that trigger whenever the use state value of cart items changes. And if you remember, in fact, each of these three values are being stored as separate use states. How they update is based off of use effect. So there's a bunch of hook architecture that we've set up inside of cart context in order to make this work. So this is a very React defiant way of updating these three values inside of our cart context. But at the end of the day, what we do is we still update these values correspondingly so our application can use this cart state inside of our cart context. How reducers work is reducers are pretty similar, except it has a bit of a more intuitive way of thinking about how this object gets stored, and it completely distances itself away from the React way of updating state. So we don't use effects that way. But in order to understand that, let's go back to what it is that a reducer represents. So as we saw before, we were storing some object as our state value inside of cart context. That doesn't change. A reducer is still an object. So let's think about a cart reducer. So just follow me. I promise that once we explain it, it'll make sense. Cart reducer is an object, and it stores the same values. It's going to store the cart items, which is an array. It's going to store the cart count, which is an integer. It's going to store the cart total as an integer. And let's also just, in fact, store the last value that we also had in cart context, which is readable, which is cart open. If you remember, this is the Boolean that tells us if our dropdown is appearing or not. This cart reducer object, still the exact same. Nothing different here. The thing that changes is that instead of leveraging use state and use effect in order to update these values, we now utilize something called an action. And an action is very simple. It's also just an object, and it's an object that has two values on it. It has a type value, which points to a string, and then it has an optional payload value, which can be anything at all. Anything you want. Objects, integers, arrays, undefined, null, whatever you want as the payload, you can have it, and it's purely optional. Actions don't even need to have payloads. But if it were to have any properties, it can only have a type. In fact, it must have a type, and then an optional payload parameter. So now, how do we utilize these actions in order to update the cart reducer? Well, let's look at the action that gets fired, and let's look at the cart reducer and what happens in turn. So let's say, for example, we have some string value for the type. And this string is a very clear identifier. In fact, it's a unique string. And this string should describe what it is that's happening. So for us, let's say we wanted to toggle the isCartOpen value. We would want to say, hey, I'm going to fire an action, or there's going to be an action. And this action has a type of toggle cart is open. That's string. There is, again, an optional payload because we're toggling a value. We're using the previous value and switching it to the opposite value. So if it's false, it's true. If it's true, it's false. So payload doesn't matter here. We don't actually need a payload to toggle anything. So because payload doesn't define, we don't need to pass it. It's just an action with a type of string toggle cart is open. What happens now is that isCartOpen is the thing that reacts to this action. isCartOpen, we know, is the only thing that gets modified inside this object based on the fact that this action has a type toggle cart is open because we only want to toggle this value. So now that value updates to true. The other three values do not need to update. Now, let's say we wanted to make another action. And a very common one that we know we need our reducer to store is, let's say we were adding an item to our cart. So now, let's say we have this action type string as add item to cart. Well, if we're going to add something to our cart, we need to know what specifically we're trying to add. We need the product object. This is going to be the payload. That's what you're passing. You're passing the object that is the product you want to add to the cart. Here, of course, now the reducer is going to say, oh, okay, I've got this action with this type add item to cart. I'm going to take that payload, which is the object, and I'm going to update correspondingly the value to that char. cart items, cart count, and cart total all need to update whenever an item adds to cart. So what we're going to do though is that we know isCartOpen is completely unaffected by adding items to cart. So cart items will add that corresponding item into it. We might do some modifications here as we do where we create a new object that has a quantity value on it. But all that happens, the main thing is that the cart items gets updated, that array. Cart count updates its count, and cart total updates its total value also to whatever the new cost is. This flow of actions modifying cart reducers is the key thing of how reducers are different than how we're currently storing our context state inside of our cart context. So I'm going to go into how we can convert what we have now over to reducers, because this is the step-by-step to learning Redux. The first step is just learning about reducers because we can use them inside of context. And then afterwards, we'll figure out why Redux might be a better solution with reducers inside your application. But for now, this is the main thing you really need to understand. Reducers are really just these object representations of these values that receive actions. And then these actions in turn will update the values inside of the reducer object. So now that we understand this, let's learn about creating reducers inside of our context.